All right, once again, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this conversation on inclusion and belonging. We're really grateful for our speaker, Jean Morton, to be joining us from the early hours of BC, I understand. Thanks for waking up early and being here. I'm Deacon Michelle Collins. I'm the assistant to the bishop here in MNO, and I'm joined by Pastor Dave Lowe, who's the chair of the Community Ministry Committee. We're the sort of co-hosts of this conversation today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Dave to give us a little bit more of an introduction.
Um, my name is David Lowe. I'm the chair of the Community Ministry Committee, which used to be under the rubrics of the Missions Committee, which we changed name because of some of the derogatory images and less than flattering concepts that missions brings about as we struggle to new relations in the new century. The Community Ministry Committee is concerned with how do we as a synod and how do we as congregations and as part of a wider church embrace the fullness of the capacity of God to look after the world and to see what roles we can play in it. And disability is one of those issues that really confronts us in a number of ways. I have learned to experience that my own self and my own journey over the past 4 years with limited mobility and how much being disabled makes one invisible in our wider culture. And some of the movie scenes that I saw that just made me cringe a few years ago were actually experienced by me since that time. So this is something that's quite near and dear to my heart. I was asked to prepare a very brief devotion, and as a clergyman, I always balk at the word brief, but I will see what I can do about that. And I was thinking of the story of the lepers. The lepers were people that were ostracized and feared and kept apart from the community until Christ came along and did the unspeakable. Christ actually touched them and healed them, and the community healed them and welcomed them into the body of all believers. And so the question is, how do we take people whom we have shunned aside? People in wheelchairs have often been institutionalized. Disabled people have often been institutionalized. In my own public school in Shoal Harbour, Newfoundland, we had 2 children that were living with intellectual disabilities who were well past the grade 4 age limit, but were still sitting in grade 4 classes because that's the only way we could deal with them. And how does that represent any quality of life? And I think that those hidden barriers that we look up stipulate that. How we as a congregation welcome people in our midst, not just with our attitudes, but with our building. These are some of the things that being a leper, being disabled, it's not that I don't feel included in my congregation, it's that I feel excluded by the inability to participate. And so that would be my devotion. And my prayer would simply be, may we open our eyes, minds, and hearts that we might find a way to be inclusive of all people. Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you for that kind of framing and grounding and invitation into this conversation as it relates to the broader work that we are called to do, to be whole communities of people of God. So with that, I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Jean Morton. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an official introduction, even though she'll introduce herself. Jean has supported people with living with disabilities for over 30 years. She's felt called to amplify the voices of lived experience to achieve inclusion and belonging in the community where their contribution is fully valued. Jean presently works for the Cerebral Palsy Association of BC, providing policy advice and program development. She has 2 adult children, lives in North Vancouver with her husband and their fur-bearing dependents. She calls Gloria Day Lutheran Church her home. So welcome here, Jean. Thank you so much for your time and leadership in this conversation. I turn the virtual microphone over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And David, I think in the interest of full disclosure, my big brother David, all resemblance is purely an accident of birth. But I think David pretty much nailed the presentation here, because there's nothing like the voice of lived experience in this conversation. A little personal history. In my early 20s, I had a brain tumor removed. And that resulted in having the nerve to this side of my face and this ear severed. Fortunately, it was all very successful, and I was left with this artifact. One day, very shortly afterwards, I was at West Edmonton Mall holding a door open for a woman, or she was holding a door open for me. I'm sorry, I've got it backwards here. And I smiled my thank you at her, and she recoiled. And I realized that all of a sudden, the world was seeing me differently because of stigma. Now, this is not a handicapping condition. There are some other issues with it that are. But I've lived in a unique space where I can straddle both worlds. In the racial communities, they speak of somebody who's racialized but has light skin as being able to pass. And that's kind of where I sit with disability. I am able to pass. So that's the perspective that I'm bringing today. I do have a screen share here, if we can manage to pull this off again, Michelle. If I can make that happen, that would be great. Okay. So a brief outline of today. We've had our introductions and land acknowledgements, and I would just like to observe that I'm coming in from the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples, who have tended to this land from time immemorial, and we're grateful for their stewardship and hope to achieve much better reconciliation with them. Coming through, I want to talk a bit about inclusion and belonging, and what that means to us present, a bit of a history of the disability of Canada in Canada, the modeling of disability, how we come to understand what disability means is what we're talking about there. And then the language we use around disability. Moving on to accessibility, and then we have a breakout room discussion, and we'll come back in with large group discussions for the takeaways for today. So diving in, a few stats about statistics. Now I have to move the screen around a bit. Today 1917 was the last this was fully counted. There were 6.2 million Canadians who live with disability, and that represents 22% of the total population. 20% of those are working age, that's 25 to 64. And who can say that without humming the Chicago song? I'm not so sure, but 38% are seniors. SCAT-SCAN does not gather specific data to speech language disability, but interestingly, the most common disability type is pain-related, after which comes mobility, flexibility. I'm doing this from memory now rather than from my notes. Flexibility, mental health related, learning disabilities, and intellectual developmental disability. And people with disability are twice as likely to live below the poverty line. And I'm throwing that one in for folks in the church to consider, because poverty also becomes an accessibility issue in the churches that are largely seen as being middle class. And in fact, disability intersects with most of the other DEI populations. But when you think about it, disability has one additional factor of integration with the other. I shouldn't use acronyms, I'm sorry, but diversity, equity, and inclusion, denied groups. And that fact is that disability is the one commonly identified DEI group that any one of us can become a member of at any day, as David was alluding to. And I'm not offering that to be fear mongering. I'm not saying you should care about disability because you can suddenly be disabled. I'd rather think about it in terms of care about disability because of the commonality. It's people just like me who are suddenly experiencing disability. And the ability to see folks who have disability, who are in a wheelchair, who might speak differently, move differently, express themselves in many other ways differently, the ability to see our common humanity. It was really the best takeaway we can come from here. Now, I used the expression in the intro for Michelle saying that I call Gloria Dei Lutheran my home. And we use this language when we speak of our church. My church home, I belong to Gloria Dei, I belong to Grace Lutheran, I belong to the ELCIC. So I'd like to invite a discussion from you guys today. What does home and belonging mean to you? And in considering that, as you answer, consider a time when you felt a very strong sense of belonging and what happens when your sense of belonging is diminished. Can we?
All right. Yeah, so feel free to, we're a small group, but still, because I can't see everybody in the line, you can, if you use the raise hand feature, it moves you up to the top of the list so that I see it. So feel free to unmute yourself or just call out, and then let's have some conversation around these questions. I know for me, I'll start with home and belonging have something to do with interconnectedness of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Can you think of a time when you felt you belong?
And if speaking out loud is not what you want to do, you can also add it in the chat and we'll call it out in that way as well.
Pauline, you unmuted. Are you wanting to speak?
Yeah, the question is, where did I feel I belong?
Yes, where do you most feel, or where you feel you belong? And
The most where I felt I belonged was in my home when I was growing up, my home congregation, my home, the school, where everyone knew everyone. Some of us were blood relatives, some of us were not. But it was a sense of belonging, and I don't go back there often anymore because things have changed drastically. But when I do go back, it still feels like I belong.
so your familiarity with the people around you, the relationship is very important.
Yeah.
And I take it they know you as well.
Yes.
That's a part of it. And is there a safety in that for you?
There's safety and vulnerability as well.
Oh, fair enough. That's cool.
And then just calling out from the chat, feeling safe and comfortable, usually at home.
Safe and comfortable. Okay, what contributes to those feelings of comfort? What is it about home and belonging that makes you feel comfortable?
Oh yeah, so the response is I can be me.
I can be,
Sort of that authenticity piece I hear in that.
yeah.
And then Rhonda, I see your hand is up.
You muted, Rhonda.
Sorry about that. The question, what does home and belonging mean to you? I just immediately thought about, my sense of belonging, I think was when I was growing up was always home. And we moved a lot when throughout my years at home. But my mother always made whatever home we had moved to just, completely home. But also my two grandmothers, their homes were always the same. And it was a really important feeling of belonging, in the sense that nothing ever changed when I walked in the door at either grandmother's house. The furniture, the things on the walls, and it's something that a lot of people in the world, for all kinds of circumstances, don't have. They don't have grandparents anymore. They're too far away. Maybe home isn't safe, or home isn't a feeling of being loved unconditionally. So when somebody's lucky enough, because sometimes it is just sheer luck, what family we're born into, right? It's something, I think, that when we have that, we take it for granted. And then, as we become old, as we grow older, we hear about people who don't have that. And so that sense of belonging in so many different ways is just so important.
Indeed. And so you're identifying consistency and safety, being loved unconditionally, as key factors. That's great. That's great. Anybody else?
And then another comment from the chat, a sense of comfort in spaces where I can be fully myself.
Yeah.
Kind of resonates with that authenticity piece.
Yeah. And I'm just scribbling these down here just for the discussion. Anybody else on this? When you were talking about walking into your grandparents' home, I remember my mother had a practice, and she would say, when you come in through that door, the rest of the world is outside. You are home here now. This is safe. This is where people love you. But that door was very much a symbol between the world out there and a safe environment in here for us. Dave?
What?
Oh, you were leaning forward. I thought perhaps you were thinking about.
I was just looking at the messages, that's all.
Okay. Okay. Does anyone have any idea what happens if your sense of home and belonging is eroded? What's that effect? If we're associating safety with belonging, seems to be a thread, then it would follow that there's some lack of safety, vulnerability, even if both can exist, cohabitate somewhat peacefully, Colleen, families being what we are. And that authenticity, do you have to try to pretend to be somebody else? Or is that dictated by others? Okay, so delving into that a bit, and I'm just going to have to juggle because I've got the Brady Bunch squares up so I can see you more than so I'd rather see you than my screens here. I'd like to consider, I've posed this question at some length with folks who have cerebral palsy, a group of seniors who have lived with lifelong disabilities. And here are some of their observations around this question. You can see that, but I can't here. Folks are saying, home is a place where I feel safe, comfortable, and where I know I belong, and I am part of a community with a valued role to play.
Mhm.
To me, home is a place that is safe and accessible, and where there is respect and dignity. Does that resonate with anybody? Even just yay or nay by hands? Yeah, okay. When I belong, I feel safe, respected, accepted, and a part of a community where I have a role and I am able to give back. When I feel I belong, I don't feel isolated or alone, and life is easier. And the final. Belonging is built where there is an inclusive environment that is accessible and friendly, and I can expect to be treated with dignity, respect, and equality. Belonging is built when I have a mentor who has experienced similar struggles and can relate to me and guide me in the right direction by simply asking, how can I help you? So we hit on many of the same themes around safety, the interconnectedness of home and belonging. And from our seniors with CP, they add a couple of themes. And I think that this is just what they can't take for granted. And what they are telling us is that what they want is to have a role to belong in the community. They want to have a role to play where they can contribute, give back. And I think that becomes very significant. Nobody said in terms of belonging, nobody identified a curb cut or a ramp as part of their belonging. Accessibility comes into play, but it's the role they are invited to play and the way that they are regarded in the community that comes to bear. So how do we get here? A little brief note on the history of disability in Canada. This is Woodlands Institution here in Vancouver, BC. All provinces except Newfoundland have them. It's not that we were so far ahead in Newfoundland in not building them, they just didn't have the money to. So that's where David describes Tommy, who was still in grade 4 in the school in Shoal Harbour. The Industrial Revolution saw the population leaving farms, leaving the agrarian lifestyle. And suddenly, folks and dependents with disability became a liability in the society because they were preventing people from going to work. So the answer was, with all kinds of people, we'll build institutions. And some accounts, I can't really speak to this, some accounts see that as having been a progressive movement at the time, where they felt that folks with disability could wind up sleeping in barns, being neglected. And the sales pitch was, if we have congregate care, we have professional medical staff who will look after people, then that will be a much kinder environment. I can't honestly adjudicate how progressive the idea was, whether it was simply capitalist or truly progressive and interested in the care, but I think we all have an idea of how these wound out. Woodlands is close to me. A good part of my career was involved deinstitutionalizing folks at the latter end of the trenches that were coming out. So the folks we were bringing out into the community had labels like hard to serve and had behavioral challenges. This was about 20 years before we were really considering trauma-informed care, especially with this environment. And I'd like you to consider this history alongside the history that we're all much more familiar with now with our Indigenous folks. Woodlands School also had a cemetery. and the headstones from that cemetery were removed. The graves were initially marked, but the headstones were taken and they were used to pave a barbecue pit and patio for the use of the staff. And for some reason, for me, working with the folks traumatized in that environment, going into that environment, meeting people and bringing them out, somehow nothing speaks to me quite as much as the indignity on those gravestones. That, of course, and the whole question of why do we have cemeteries associated with schools? There is a much greater parallel between how we've treated folks with disability and the residential school systems than many Canadians realize. But this is also a group of people who were torn away from their families. One fellow I knew at the age of 18 months, because he needed a highly specialized diet, was brought in through those doors, never to see his family again. And the very similar problems, unexplained deaths were easily swept under the carpet because the people were in the care of an in-house doctor. If somebody should elope, they were, the police would find them and immediately bring them back without recourse. So there is a very unfortunate history of how we've been dealing with disability and the stigma that is attached to it here. And that brings me to thinking about how do we think about disability? Okay, because the residential schools, the institutions, I want one more thing about the institutions for folks with disability. They didn't get to go home when they graduated or at the age they would graduate high school. So most of the people who entered these institutions never did get out. In the 1950s and 60s, associations such as the one I work for now, the Cerebral Palsy Association, mostly made of parents, started to move, rebel against the idea that their children needed to be isolated. And they developed what's called the community living movement. And that has morphed into the disability rights movement today. So most of the institutions in Canada are closed now, but there are still a few. I'm not quite sure. I'm reading about the Manitoba Developmental School in Portage. I believe it's in its last throes of existence, but I'm not sure that it's entirely emptied yet. But anyway, moving to the medical model. The medical model sees disability as being part and parcel of the impairment in the individual. Okay, I am disabled by bad knees, for example. And the medical model strives to mediate, heal, fix whatever is wrong with the person. Everything rests within the person on this model. It gives a lot of authority to doctors and medical staff. It moves the expertise about disability away from that of lived experience and into the hands of the medical practitioners. And many of you who've been through a lot of medical systems are aware that I think now we commonly speak of medical PTSD from that. I don't want to imply all criticism here. Medical advancements have done a great deal for folks with disability, but fixing it isn't always the answer. The social model of disability looks at disability as inherent in the relationship between a person's impairment and the environment. I have a deaf ear, one ear only, stone deaf from that same surgery I described. In this environment, my hearing ear, using a headphone, I am entirely unimpaired. And in most quiet conversations, I am unimpaired. But take me to a loud environment, worst of all is, say, a nightclub, and I can hear nothing. I am not only hard of hearing, I am functionally deaf in that environment. So the disability lies somewhere in between me and my interaction with the environment. A person who uses a wheelchair isn't in any way hampered until they encounter stairs. So the social model of disability puts an onus on us to look at the built environment and our attitudes in terms of how we define disability. So rather than the person being the sole source of the functional problem, it lies in between. The social model also offers the notion that of inspiration. The mantra from the author of the term social model, an activist from Australia, the late Stella Young, and she said, "I am not your inspiration." And unfortunately, we do see a lot of ads, especially for services for children, where, it's a cute kid in a wheelchair, maybe using forearm crutches, asking you to give, tugging at the heartstrings. Pity isn't helpful for folks with disability. And I just want to throw in here the cultural models, because there are many, because there are cultures. So cultural models in some cases have said, well, disability is the result of some moral failing on behalf of that person. This is God's punishment, because for some wrong that person, sin that person has inflicted either themselves or as punishment on their family. That's one way of looking at it. And another way I've heard this story from a number of people, and most recently from the elder Lewis Cardinal from Edmonton. And I was doing a session with a number of groups, and we were trying to increase awareness of cerebral palsy on Vancouver Island, which has very many, 200 and some Indigenous First Nations. And we were being very proactive to make sure that they were involved from the very beginning, because medical services that we're attached to is one of those areas that has greatly broken trust. So I thought, oh, I'm so good, I'm coming in with the social model. Well, the social model landed flat like pancakes. And one elder looked at me and said, but we don't see children like that at all. It's a, strengths-based model. We see all children as strengths. And the story Lewis Cardinal was expressing was that his nation, and I've heard this of other Indigenous nations, perceive that every child is born as the result of a prayer from the family, the community, the nation. Sometimes when I heard that, I would process that to, oh, they prayed for a child, but that's not what they're talking about. This child comes to the world bearing the gifts to solve whatever that prayer had. So the Creator is sending the gifts to the world. And the imaging that goes with that is that babies are born with their little fists clutched. And it is the role of that community and family to open those fists to reveal those gifts. And there are rituals about how you can present a finger to an infant around that. And so I rather like to think of that idea as we approach disability, that if everyone, if we listen to the folks that were speaking about belonging and their need to be recognized for having a contribution, a role, and bringing gifts to play. I think often within the church, we've had the tendency to think of the disabled as people that we minister to, not that we receive ministry from. And I can tell you honestly, in my decades of work with disability, I have gained more than I have ever contributed within that community. Before we head on, are there any questions or comments so far, or observations? Nope. Okay. Now I'm just juggling to move the screen again. You can't see that I'm doing that, I trust, or can you? No, you can't. Okay, that's good. That's a very good thing. Okay. So recently, the United Nations has gotten into the conversation, holding a convention on the rights of persons with disabilities. And Canada eventually, in our own kind of good time, has signed on to parts of this. The convention's main purpose is to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. Persons with disabilities are defined, and heads up folks, this will be the social model again, as those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. And that's Article 1. The emphasis in the bold there is my own. And that's the standard we want to achieve if we are entering work with folks with disabilities. And that is the full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. In this context, we can substitute full and effective participation in the life of the parish on an equal basis with others. And again, I'm juggling here. Coming to this, as I thought of the Indigenous story, I thought back to the LBW Green Book. I'm assuming most people here are Lutheran, or I'm not certain, of our audience. There's a point in the baptism service where the pastor's exhortation states, through baptism, God has made these new sisters and brothers members of the priesthood that we all share in Christ Jesus, that we may all proclaim the praise of God. And there is more to that. I'm shortening there. And the assembled respond, we welcome you into the Lord's body. We receive you as fellow members in the body of Christ, children of the same heavenly Father, and workers with us in the kingdom of God. And having infant baptism, of course, we don't always know whether that child is disabled or not disabled. And I would like to think that this welcome into the community doesn't matter whether that child or adult, as the case may be, has a disability. But that's the point at which we've achieved accessibility in the church. When the person in the wheelchair, the person whose speech cannot be understood, who has unclear speech, can participate fully on an equal basis as a fellow worker in the kingdom of God. A word on ableism, then. And ableism is a difficult concept to get your head around. Quick definition, people with disabilities are seen as less important or valuable than able-bodied individuals. This can lead to exclusion from employment, healthcare, education, or other basic services. And it's reflected in physical barriers, inherent biases. The thing about ableism is I'm not going to pretend that I really want to wind up in a wheelchair. But the distinction here is how do we value the person, the personhood, okay? Ableism is even implicit within the disability community itself. We call it the disability hierarchy. So the person who has clear speech, professional background, just happens to use a wheelchair, they're kind of the higher up. But as folks have more difficulty with speech language communication, perhaps intellectual disabilities, then the bar just gets dropped a bit. This is something we need to be aware of, I think, and very leery of, be careful to identify. I'm sensitive to this because the folks I described bringing out of Woodlands would have fallen at the very bottom of the disabled hierarchy. And I'm sorry, sometimes the thoughts with me and my brain just leaves altogether. But it's just an awareness. Oh, I know what I was thinking of. In the, and again, going back to comparing with racialized people of color, sometimes within those communities, fairer skinned people are seen as having greater value, more status than those who are darker. You know, in the Asian subcontinent, you see skin lightening products. And this is kind of the disabilities community than that. Ableism is often reflected in observations like, well, I'd rather be dead than have that happen to me. Are you saying that the person it's happened to should be dead? There's a question there. My next is as a personal story. One young fellow, not a young fellow, a middle-aged fellow in one of the residences I worked in, who had come out of Woodlands. He was nonverbal, walked with when he was led, but needed help to eat with every other activity of daily living. And he had some blocking behaviors. He would slap his head and make some odd noises. And he passed away. And we scrambled to manage a funeral for him. This was just at the age my son was 13. I think was his last. He sang, and he agreed to perform on Eagle's Wings at this funeral for me and for the congregation, which was a nice touch because some family showed up that we weren't aware existed. Anyhow, we get in the car going away from that service, and he looks at me, he says, "Mom, will Bruce have autism in heaven?" And as this is a community of faith we're meeting with, I invite you to answer that question for yourself. I'm not going to ask you to discuss it here necessarily. You can if you want, but how do you respond to that? Is there room for autism in heaven? And then my only other observation for this on this is the question of medical assistance in dying. And that's where an ableist viewpoint can be very, very concerning. We're getting more and more cases now where people are being offered medical assistance in dying instead of adequate supports so that they can live and contribute in life as they want. And these are being documented, and I'd just like to put that in there again for your consideration as these discussions come up. I admit myself, if I were faced with a a diagnosis of ALS that I actually had to be screened for a couple of years ago. That's going to make you look at MAID one way. But I'm very, very concerned about any third parties having the authority to exercise MAID on behalf of anybody else. So, okay, are we able to move along then? I just want to give a moment if I'm jumping a lot at once. Okay. No, I have jumbled up two, have I? Sort of. I've messed up the slide, I'm afraid. And I just did that this minute. Let me see if I can fix it somehow. I might be able to, so you can read it a little more clearly. A little more how-to, because I was asked today to do a presentation on accessibility, and I took some liberties to go beyond that. So I brought along a few pointers for how to express welcome. Etiquette when someone's in a wheelchair. One is ask if they would like assistance before you help. It may not be needed or wanted. Often somebody with a disability might be doing something that looks like it's really awkward. And it might even look like it's really painful. But don't touch unless you're asked. Okay. It is amazing. People in wheelchairs wheeling down the street, quite in control of their own life, will frequently all of a sudden find somebody unbeknownst to them has taken control of their wheelchair. It's a terrifying experience. You don't know who's behind you, what's happening, what they're doing. Okay. Don't hang on or lean onto a person's wheelchair. Consider that a part of their physical being, their personal space. And if you're in a conversation that lasts more than a few minutes, consider sitting down to be at eye level. This just kneeling down, you don't really have to. It's quite acceptable to stand upright and hold a conversation with somebody who is in a wheelchair. It's just for comfort to be at eye level, but you don't have to crouch over them. Don't patronize this person by patting them on the head. Now that might seem self-evident, but unfortunately it's not. It's really quite common for people.
Or the hand.
What's that, David?
Or the hand.
Or the hand, their body, period. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's the patronizing part. So yeah, don't touch, basically. It's patronizing. And I know a fella who happens to have cerebral palsy. He's in a wheelchair. He does not have a speech impairment at all, not even a slight accent. He's married with a young child. Stella is a raging 18 months old now. He owns his own business. He's married, owns his own home. Yet out in the community last week, a woman came up to him, patted him on the head, and asked if she could pray for him. And he tried to be gracious and say, thank you. I appreciate that, but I'm really doing quite fine here. Quite honestly, here in the Lower Mainland, Marco has pretty much rung the golden bell with his own home and family and such. He just happens to have a wheelchair. But this woman was insistent that he needed her prayers. So that's just something to think about there. Don't classify a person who uses a wheelchair as sick. Wheelchairs are used for a variety of non-contagious diseases and disabilities. Speak directly to the person in the wheelchair, not to somebody who's nearby or the person who's with them. Speak to the person in the wheelchair. Don't treat them as if they don't exist. If your legs don't work, it doesn't generally affect your ears or your mouth. And when a person using a wheelchair transfers out of the wheelchair, if they've moved down to a couch or if they are walking a bit, they go to the toilet or into a car, don't move that wheelchair out of their way. It's a very common thing. Move into a wheelchair. Well, I want to pull up next to you. I'll just swing your chair out of the way. I'm likely to get up, walk away, and you can't reach it. So basically, let the person who owns the wheelchair control all aspects of it. It's okay to use terms like running along when you're speaking to somebody in a wheelchair. Don't worry about idiomatic phrases. Going out for a walk. You don't have to get tongue-tied over that kind of thing. We'll talk about language in a minute, but you don't need to be tongue-tied. And don't discourage children from asking questions about the wheelchair. I like to say to folks, when a kid asks, tell them, just say hi. I'm constantly amazed by the generosity of the folks I work with in their willingness to take time out of their day to explain kindly to a kid what's going on. That's a very different thing from an adult coming up and asking, what's wrong with you? Or why are you in the wheelchair? If an adult is asking that question, then it becomes intrusive, right? And don't assume that using a wheelchair in itself is a tragedy. It's a means of freedom that allows that person to get around independently. Some people use wheelchairs just to avoid fatigue. They get too fatigued from walking too far. I would also like to say, David is talking about don't touch. People often get kind of tied up about how to introduce to somebody in a wheelchair. By all means, extend your hand, shake hands. If a person doesn't have full use of their hands, they may put their hand up, just respond as they indicate. Okay. Now this one, I'm going to have to do a little trick and come up with another screen here. I have this section. Again, this is going back to my folks with disability, having their voice being represented here. This was constructed on the notion of folks who have difficulty speaking and may not be clearly understood. And so we'd like to acknowledge that everyone has the right to speak in whatever form that may take, be heard and acknowledged, creating a welcoming environment where everybody feels welcome, create a welcoming environment where everyone feels welcome to speak up. This comes up with us a lot on Zoom. If you have participants who may need to type in because of speech language disability, don't let the conversation carry on while they are entering what they have to say. What will happen? If I have the floor, I can't speak, I start typing, everyone else talks, the whole conversation moves ahead before I have time to get my 2 cents worth in. So we are uncomfortable with dead air, but just take a moment and acknowledge the air is dead, and we're just going to take a minute while Jean types. Plan realistic time limits to allow everyone to be heard. Adjust agenda expectations so that no one has to be too rushed to feel comfortable speaking. When somebody is using augmentative communication, or even if they're allowing somebody with them to translate for them, it takes a whole bunch longer, and we need to accommodate that time frame so that they are able to express that. To truly make a person part of the conversation, this is the point I jumped ahead. Those around him or her should stop further conversation until that person is finished communicating. In this society, we are used to going a million miles an hour. We aren't used to taking our time to truly listen. We also seem to fear, or at least feel comfortable with, times of silence. Speak directly and only to the person you are addressing, not to their companion. And we spoke about that before. If you are a companion or a support worker, do not answer or speak for a person unless they ask you to. Allow time for the person to complete their statement. Do not try to complete their thoughts or answer before they are finished. And that's very common, that we're helpfully listening attentively and trying to understand what they're saying. And then when, they haven't quite finished, you jump in and complete the thought. Listen attentively. If you are unable to make out what was said, ask for clarification, even if it takes a few tries. Repeat or paraphrase that you understood for confirmation. We were doing a panel, 3 members of our panel had trouble with speech in a group of social workers. And it was very interesting that those social workers from the hospital environment were not comfortable saying, "Excuse me, Jean, I didn't catch that." Afterwards, they wrote to me to say that, they had missed some. But there's nothing in the world wrong with saying to a person who has difficulty with speech, "Can you try again?" In my experience, and I've talked to people about the process as well and asked them, they'd rather repeat 50 times so that you hear. Because the biggest challenge of somebody with any trouble with language is the willingness of other people to participate in whatever kind of communication system that they use. And then finally, you will encounter some people who don't have any speech and might not have access to a symbolic forms of communication. They don't have an iPad they can't use. In that case, just ask them to show you how they indicate yes and no. And once you've got that, then you can frame questions that require a yes and no answer. And in that way, you can communicate directly with that person. That tends to happen more with kids or people with their parents around, but it's handy to have a way of knowing how you can broach that. Now I'm going to get rid of that one, and I'm back to where I want to be. Yay. Okay. So I've got a few considerations for accessibility in the church for consideration. And the first one is, can a person with a disability enter your building without assistance? Right? Does somebody have to scramble and hold doors for them if they've just come in? And with this, I want to remind on these first 2 questions. And the second one is, are the ushers trained in finding seating for wheelchairs without a fuss? If a person with a wheelchair comes into church tomorrow, do you have to start pulling pews around or assembling chairs in order to accommodate? Or can that person simply be shown a reasonable place where they can be located in the sanctuary? And the logic behind this is that participation on a full and equal footing, right? So you want to be able to assist in a way that doesn't draw a whole lot of attention. One of my favorite scenes is a crowded sidewalk. Somebody's walking down with a wheelchair. The crowds will part like the Red Sea, right? It's perfectly acceptable to make room for a person in a wheelchair, but the over-exaggerated response can be very stigmatizing. Okay, can a person seated in a wheelchair see throughout all parts of the service? So there are many parts of the service when we hear "let us stand," or some pastors will add "as you are able." It's a nice touch. But when everyone stands, is the person with a mobility issue, what do they see? Can they make out screens that many of the churches have for the bulletins? Or are they just going to see the back of somebody's butt? What is the viewpoint from there? How much of the physical plant, how much of it can they gain access to? Can a mom in a wheelchair get down to the Sunday school classes? In many congregations, those are located in the basement. What if that mom wants to teach Sunday school, or even not a mom, just a member of the parish wants to teach Sunday school? Are the bulletins available in large print? Is there high color contrast for people? Say, is there a calming room available, a sensory room? Are members of the congregation supportive if a child met down? The way we respond to disability doesn't just affect disabled adults. We consider the whole family of a child with a disability, and particularly autism. And often these are people who really need the community of the church. They're living in great isolation. In the parish where I raised my kids, I'd been there about 3 years and knew a family. They were founding members on the founding documents of the church. They had a daughter who was my age, and 2 or 3 years in, I found out that they had a son who was living in a community resource, much like I was running. In fact, I had supported that group home's manager to get that position, had been the reference. Brian was a functioning part of that family. When he became an adult, they did move into assisted living, but he had never set foot in that church. Now, some of that had a lot to do with the time. Brian would be around my age, so we're talking about in the 60s, when it was just becoming, that community living movement was just emerging. But even still, how many people associated with your parish may not feel that all members of the family are welcome, right? And then looking at some other areas, is your coffee hour accessible? It's not just the service. What are the acoustics like? I told you about my deaf ear. Well, coffee hour in my own parish is impossible for me. I can't hear a word of anyone speaking to me because of the degree of background noise and the ambient poor acoustics in the parish hall. Are there places for people who are using mobility aids to set down cups? Are there seats around the side, perhaps with a little bit of room for quiet? This might not be politically correct in some circles. Are bendy straws available? For folks with disabilities, bendy straws are a life-saving adaptive aid. And although it's not actually commonly known or practiced yet, all restaurants are actually required to have them available under the plastic restriction laws. That point kind of got lost. And finally, is the altar or the lectern itself accessible? Because people with disabilities can also be leaders and pastors within the parish, not just the people we reach out to.
I was going to say, Jean, it's really ironic that I sit there in my walker or wheelchair on Sunday morning and say, please stand if you are able, while I keep my ass firmly planted.
Okay, I'm not going to touch the insults that could come from that one. Nobody needs that sibling. Okay, and where are we now? I seem to have missed a slide, so I'm going to come back to language, because that's a question that often comes up around disability. The R word. I am old enough, and I think many of you might be old enough as well, to remember when the term mental retardation was meant as a kinder, gentler description, replacing older, ruder words. It's come to the point now where we don't even say it aloud the way I just did it. We call it the R word. And I was suspicious of that when it first came about, until I worked with a group that called themselves We Survived Woodlands. And that's when I heard of the construction, the R word. Because to them, having that label, and it's a label, not a diagnosis, it's merely a label, gave the state authority to take away all of their human rights. That one word. They no longer had self-determination, autonomy. They were able to be locked up, mistreated without recourse. So that's the power of language of when we talk about being careful about how we phrase things. Sometimes I do a full workshop just on language, so I'm going to confine this a bit, and I'm not going to go through many examples. Most of the style guides that we have when we're writing refer to person-first language, so that we speak of a person who lives with cerebral palsy, a person with a disability, a person with a speech impairment. And the idea behind the person first is to separate the personhood from the disability or the disabling condition. There is a movement in some areas in the disability community now that actually prefer identity-based language. And identity-based language first occurred in the deaf community, and the autistic community has very much picked that up. And they're saying, no, I'm going to reclaim deafness or autism. It's a part of who I am. And it's a part of my identity. And therefore, I am an autistic, I am autistic. There's a Black comedian, African-American comedian, interviewing Judy Heumann, who was recently passed. She was a very influential disability advocate in the States, and they were discussing this. W. Kamau Bell was the name of the comedian I was speaking to. And he related to the identity base saying, yeah, he said, I'm a Black man. I'm not a man with Blackness. And that metaphor with the identity-based language preferences helped me understand that a little better. Some younger folks are employing what they call cripple punk language. And that is an attempt to reclaim the hurtful words. This is they're throwing terms back and forth within their own community, the way members of the African American community will use the N-word when referring to each other. And just like in that example, if you encounter cripple punk, it's not appropriate for somebody who's able-bodied or not a part of their specific community to engage in that kind of language with them. But be aware if you encounter it. So I haven't given you a real answer of which to choose. And so the first consideration I invite you to consider on label and your language is, first of all, is why do you need a label? Very often we can fully interact and describe a person who has a disability without reference, and it can be fully appropriate. So that's number one. Number two, there are times when it's necessary to refer to a disability. And in that case, it's always appropriate simply to ask the person, how do you self-refer? last winter, I was working with the group who produced those slides and realized, how do you want me to describe speech language disability? I talked to them a lot about how to interact, but I'd never asked them what language to use. And that particular group prefers the term speech impairment over speech impediment. They feel that that's a little more isolated from them. So I think that looking at how people relate to language tells us a lot about how people are seeing themselves within the community and invites us to consider how we are seeing them.
So these questions that Jean has lifted up, I'll try to transcribe them into the chat as I can. How does your community extend welcome to people with disabilities? Who is attached to your parish but has limited involvement because of disability? And how does today's session affect your understanding of ministry to shut-ins? And so that the question is, right, how does this content connect with your context? So I think, yeah, I think we're a small enough group if we can be respectful of, right, the space that we take up and create space for everyone to share and listen responsibly to one another. I think we can just have a couple minutes of this conversation together. So whether you want to take on these questions particularly, but the general question is, how does this look and work in your context? So I'm going to invite Jean to maybe stop sharing the slides so that we can all see one another.
Okay. The first question that I've posed is, how do you extend welcome? There's been a lot of effort with the LGBTQ2 communities for the churches to express welcome. There are many rainbow crosswalks. My home parish has a knit rainbow tree that's been vandalized a couple of times, and the community comes back together. But I don't see much effort advertising to the disability community that they are welcome, or that that a parish is accessible, or better yet, is inviting people to let us know what we can do to make it accessible. It's kind of akin.
Sorry.
It's okay. It's kind of akin to inviting somebody in for dinner. You know, they're going to assume that you have set a place at the table for them. They're not going to. You're not going to invite somebody into dinner and leave them wandering around behind the table your family sits at. So the curb cut, the door openers, those sorts of things are really akin to just the place at the table as invitations, as I see it.
One of the phrases you used, Jean, was the shut-ins.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't help but wonder, to what extent do we in the church institutionalize our membership by saying that they are shut in, rather than finding ways to be more inclusive? Not obviously, some things will require a complete impossibility to get here. Somebody who's bedridden or something like that. But like, for the most part, our whole definition of shut-ins doesn't define them so much as defines our inability or incapacity or unwillingness to adopt our service.
Very much so. Very much so. And not only thinking about that, but think about identifying who are the people we identify as shut-ins. So as you're saying, okay, somebody who is bedridden, for example. Although I can tell you a story of someone who was bedridden who very desperately wanted to come for communion and did. So even that is possible if you have enough determination. But there seems to be an evolution with age of once a person reaches a point of, I guess, the inevitable decline of aging, that they're no longer coming to church. And we also know that these same seniors are suffering from severe social isolation. And we also know that the implications, the health implications of that kind of isolation is akin to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So it's, I think that you raise a really valid point. Do shut-ins have to be shut in their own home, or how can we be more welcoming and inclusive? You know, it's just like the mom of a child with certain disabilities will assume that they can't be at the church. You know? So it's there's really the thing to do is to talk to the people, and find out what their particular barriers are, like Michelle was talking about with the installation of ashes, that just sitting for an hour may be too long, and I mean, that could, in many cases, could be mediated simply by a culture that allows people to wander around, right? The at Gloria Day, where my kids grew up, actually the sacristy was intended to be the crying room. And there's a whole area behind the nave so that there was no crying room off in the corners. It was intentionally developed to be just on the periphery so people could still attend to the service. The only trouble is we parents tended to wander further and use the sacristy for the scolding room rather than the crying room, but that was the whole thing. When you saw one of us cart the kid off in there, you knew something was happening. But it's that's a profound question.
All right. Any final thoughts as we kind of turn the corner here to wrap up this what I've found to be a really rich conversation? Jean, what I appreciate about what you've brought to us is not just the content, but also the heart, the context and the character of the people that we're called to be inclusive and belong with, right? That we belong to them as much as they belong to us. So thank you so much for being here and for the work that you do and for just continuing to call us to attention on these matters.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. I greatly appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to meet you.